There is a moment, deep in the wilderness, when the world goes completely silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence you might imagine when you close your eyes and think of forests. Not the kind that comes after a long day when everything settles and the birds find their branches and the wind drops away to nothing. This is a different kind of silence entirely. This is the silence that arrives without warning, the kind that presses in from every direction at once, the kind that every creature alive on this planet has been trained by millions of years of evolution to recognize immediately for exactly what it is. It is the silence of danger. And on a cold October morning, deep in the boreal forest of northern Canada, a man running alone on a trail through the trees felt that silence fall over him like a wall. His name was Marcus, 34 years old, trail runner, experienced hiker, someone who had spent the better part of a decade learning the rhythms of wild places. He knew these forests. He had run this particular trail dozens of times. He knew where the roots reached up across the path, where the soft ground gave way under heavy rainfall, where the light came through the canopy in long golden shafts during the late afternoon. He knew the trail the way you know a road you drive every single day, without thinking, without effort, the knowledge living somewhere below conscious thought. But he had never experienced anything quite like this. He had been running for about 45 minutes, settling into the long, comfortable rhythm that experienced trail runners know well. That state where the body moves almost on its own, and the mind drifts into a kind of focused calm. The forest was dense on both sides of the trail, spruce and fir pressing in close, their lower branches carrying the dead brown needles that never see enough light to survive long. The ground was soft with accumulated years of fallen leaves and decomposed wood. The trail itself was narrow, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side, and it wound through the trees following the natural contours of the land, rising and dipping gently, occasionally opening up where an old blowdown had left a gap in the canopy. He had just crested a small rise and started down the other side when he saw it. And the world went silent. If you have never seen a moose in the wild, standing close, standing still, standing in the middle of your only path forward, it is very difficult to convey through words alone what the experience actually feels like. A photograph does not do it. A video comes closer, but still misses something essential. What it misses is the sheer physical reality of the animal, the sense of something so large and so alive, occupying the same small space as you, that the air between you seems to change in quality, seems to thicken. A mature bull moose in October is one of the most formidable animals on the North American continent. This is not a fact that most people carry around with them day to day. Moose do not feature in the same conversations as bears or wolves or mountain lions when people talk about dangerous wildlife. But they should. A bull moose can stand close to 2 meters at the shoulder. It can weigh anywhere from 400 to 700 kilograms, and in exceptional cases more than that. Its antlers, in a mature bull during the autumn rut, can spread more than 1.5 meters from tip to tip. And crucially, unlike many large animals, a moose in the grip of the rut is not thinking clearly. It is running on a hormonal tide that has been building for weeks, a chemical storm that strips away caution and replaces it with something closer to fury. This was exactly what Marcus was facing. Before we go any further, before we follow him into those next few minutes that he would later describe as the most terrifying of his life, if you want more stories like this one, stories of wild encounters and the thin line between disaster and survival, hit that subscribe button right now. These are the stories that deserve to be told properly, and there are many more of them to come. Now, back to the trail. Marcus stopped running almost instantly, not because he made a conscious decision to stop. The body makes that decision before the mind catches up. There is something very old in the human nervous system, something that predates language and reason and all the accumulated weight of civilization, and it responds to the sight of a large predator or a large dangerous animal the same way it always has, the same way it did when our ancestors lived in the same forests and competed for the same resources. It floods the body with adrenaline, and it stops forward movement while the higher brain scrambles to catch up and figure out what to do next. Marcus stopped. He stood on the trail, perhaps 25 meters from the bull, and he looked at it, and it looked at him. The moose was standing broadside across the trail, its massive head turned toward him, its eyes fixed on him with an expression that is very hard to read in any animal, but that in a moose during the rut carries a particular quality of assessment, of calculation, of something that is not quite thought, but is not simply instinct either. The antlers were extraordinary. Later, Marcus would estimate the spread at close to 150 centimeters, maybe more. They caught what little light filtered through the canopy and seemed almost to glow. The animal's breath was visible in the cold morning air. Little clouds of vapor rising from its nostrils at irregular intervals. Its coat was the deep, dark brown of wet bark. Its legs, absurdly long and thin relative to that enormous body, were planted firmly on the trail. It showed no sign of moving. October is the worst possible month for an encounter like this. It is the height of the rut, the breeding season, the period during which a bull moose is at its most unpredictable and most dangerous. During the rut, bulls have been documented charging vehicles, attacking horses, destroying fences, and on several recorded occasions seriously injuring or killing people who simply had the misfortune to be between them and where they wanted to go, or who moved in a way that triggered an attack response. A running human, in the estimation of a rutting bull moose, can register as a fleeing rival, as a threat, or sometimes simply as an obstacle that needs to be removed. Marcus knew all of this. He was not an uninformed person stepping into the wilderness for the first time. He had read the literature. He had done the courses. He had spoken to wildlife biologists and forest rangers. He knew that a moose at this distance, in this state, required careful handling. He also knew that the trail was the only way back. The forest on either side was dense enough to be nearly impassable, a tangle of spruce boughs and deadfall that would slow him to a crawl and make any kind of evasive movement nearly impossible. And behind him, the trail climbed back over the rise he had just descended, which meant that if the moose charged, it would be running downhill on terrain it knew far better than he did. He stood still. He kept his arms loose at his sides. He looked away from the animal, not directly at it, because direct eye contact in the language of large mammals carries a specific meaning that is rarely helpful in a standoff. He breathed slowly, deliberately, trying to bring his heart rate down from the explosive spike that the initial sighting had caused. The moose did not move. This is actually one of the most important things to understand about moose encounters, and about encounters with large wildlife generally. The first moments, the initial period of mutual assessment, are in many cases the most critical. What happens in those first 30 seconds to a minute can determine everything that follows. An animal that might have charged if startled, if confronted with sudden loud noise or rapid movement, will very often hold if the other party holds. The standoff becomes a kind of conversation conducted entirely without words, a negotiation carried out through posture and stillness, and the management of distance. Marcus was having that conversation. He was also, quietly, beginning to assess his options. Not in a panicked way, not running through catastrophic scenarios. In the careful, methodical way that people who spend real time in wild places learn to think when things get serious. He noted the density of the brush to his left. He noted a large spruce about 5 meters off the trail to his right, with branches low enough to climb, though climbing a tree to escape a moose is in practice much more difficult and less effective than it sounds. He noted the distance between himself and the animal, the angle of the trail, the quality of the footing under his feet. And then the moose moved. Not toward him, not yet. It shifted its weight, rolled its enormous head, and made a sound. Moose sounds are unlike anything most people have heard. This was somewhere between a grunt and a groan, a deep guttural vocalization that seemed to come from somewhere very low in the animal's chest, and that carried in the cold morning air with a directness that Marcus would later describe as almost physical, like something you feel as much as hear. The bull was announcing itself. It was doing what rutting bulls do, communicating size and presence and the readiness to defend both. Marcus did not move. He would later reflect that this was perhaps the single most important decision he made in the entire encounter. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to do something, to back up, to call out, to wave his arms, to turn and run. The impulse to flee is almost irresistible when your nervous system is operating at that level of arousal. But he had internalized, somewhere along the way, the knowledge that sudden movement is very often what converts a standoff into an attack. That the moment you run, you change the dynamic entirely. You are no longer a stationary object of uncertain purpose. You are a moving target, and in the brain of a rutting bull moose, moving targets invite pursuit. He stood still. The bull grunted again. It turned its head, and the antlers swung through the air with a slow, almost lazy power that nonetheless communicated their function with absolute clarity. These were not decorative structures. They were weapons, shaped by millions of years of violent competition, capable of delivering tremendous force, capable of pinning a person against a tree or to the ground, and doing catastrophic damage. Then something happened that Marcus had not anticipated. A sound from behind the bull. From somewhere deeper in the forest, further down the trail, came an answering grunt. Lower, slightly different in character, but unmistakably the same type of vocalization. There was another moose back there. Marcus could not see it from where he stood, but the bull heard it, and the quality of the bull's attention shifted. Its head came up sharply, those great ears rotating forward like satellite dishes, orienting toward a signal. For a moment, it seemed to forget entirely about the human standing frozen on the trail behind it. This is a thing that happens in nature, and that is easy to misread in the moment. The removal of the animal's attention from you feels like relief, and relief is the enemy of good decision-making, because relief makes you want to act on the instinct that has been suppressed for however long the standoff has been going on. It makes you want to move, to take advantage of the moment, to create distance between yourself and the danger. Marcus wanted very badly to take a step backward, and he stopped himself, because he understood something that many people in his position do not understand in time. The bull had not forgotten about him. It had simply divided its attention. A rutting bull during a standoff is simultaneously tracking everything in its environment. It knows where the trail is, it knows where the human is, it knows where the second moose is, and if the human moves at the wrong moment, if the movement is interpreted as an attempt to interfere or to approach, the response can be instantaneous and violent. He waited. The forest held its collective breath, or so it seemed to Marcus, standing there in his running gear, with his heart hammering and his muscles rigid with the effort of not moving. The cold was getting into him now. He had been stopped long enough that the heat generated by running was dissipating rapidly. He could feel the chill against his face, against the backs of his hands. The bull turned its head back toward him and began to walk forward. Not charging, not at full speed, but walking, that long-legged rolling gait of a large moose moving with purpose, eating up the distance between them with a casualness that was in some ways more frightening than a full charge would have been. A charge at least carries the clarity of obvious intent. This was something more ambiguous. This was a large, dangerous, unpredictable animal, deciding to close the gap between itself and Marcus, for reasons that Marcus could not fully interpret. He did what he had always been told to do. He spoke, calmly, not loudly, not in a high voice, but in a firm, even tone, just talking, saying words that did not particularly matter, identifying himself as human, as something that was not a rival moose, not prey, not a threat. This sounds almost comically inadequate in the face of 700 kilograms of animal moving toward you on a narrow trail, and yet it is exactly what experienced wildlife managers and biologists recommend. The human voice, used correctly, often functions as a dissonant signal in an encounter like this. It does not compute with whatever threat response framework the animal is running. It introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty in a moose that is not fully committed to an attack can create hesitation, and hesitation is sometimes all you need. The bull stopped. It was closer now. Perhaps 15 meters. Marcus could see the texture of its coat, the moisture on its nostrils, the particular quality of its eye. He kept talking. He was aware, on some level, of how absurd this was. A man in trail shoes talking quietly to a moose on a trail in the northern forest. But absurdity is not a criterion for effectiveness, and what mattered was that the bull had stopped. They stayed like that for what Marcus estimated was somewhere between 2 and 4 minutes, though he acknowledged that time perception at that level of stress is unreliable. He could have been standing there for 30 seconds or 10 minutes. What he knew was that he was standing there, and the moose was standing there, and neither of them was moving, and the forest around them was utterly still. Then, with no visible trigger, no sound or movement that Marcus could identify as the cause, the bull moved off the trail. Not away, not back down the trail in the direction of the second moose. Sideways. It turned and walked into the forest to the right of the trail, pushing through the spruce boughs with a noise of snapping wood and rustling needles that seemed enormously loud in the silence. It moved perhaps 10 meters into the trees and stopped. Marcus could see it between the trunks, standing, watching him, its breath still visible in the cold air. He began to move backward, slowly, one step at a time, not turning around, keeping his eyes on the shape of the bull in the trees. He moved up the rise behind him at a pace that cost him enormous effort to maintain because every nerve in his body was demanding that he turn and sprint. He did not turn and sprint. He moved backward, step by careful step, until the bull was no longer visible, until the rise was between him and the place where it had been, and then he kept going. He ran back the way he had come, not in panic, but in the focused, purposeful way of someone who has made a clear decision. He ran for a mile, and then stopped and sat on a rock at the edge of the trail and let the shaking start. That is what happens afterward. The body does not shake during the encounter because it cannot afford to. But once the immediate danger is past, once the adrenaline starts to recede, everything that the nervous system was holding in place comes loose at once. His hands trembled. His legs felt hollow. He sat on the rock in the cold forest and breathed, and let the shaking run its course. He was unhurt, he was safe, he had done everything right. But the story does not end there, and the story is actually not only about Marcus and one moose on one trail, on one cold October morning. It is about something larger than that. It is about what happens when the worlds of humans and wild animals collide, which they are doing with increasing frequency and in increasingly consequential ways. It is about the nature of large animals, about what they actually are, and how they actually behave, as opposed to how popular culture tends to represent them. And it is about the specific ecology of the boreal forest, which is one of the most important and least understood ecosystems on the planet. So let us go back a little further. The boreal forest covers an enormous swathe of the northern hemisphere. In North America alone, it stretches from the Atlantic coast of Newfoundland all the way to Alaska, a band of coniferous and mixed forest that represents the largest terrestrial biome on Earth. This is not wilderness in the romanticized postcard sense. It is a working ecosystem, dynamic and complex, shaped by fire and ice and the movements of water and the slow grinding work of geology. It is home to species that have evolved specifically for its conditions, animals and plants whose entire biology is tuned to the extremes of the northern climate, the long cold winters, the brief explosive summers, the particular quality of light in a place where the sun barely rises in December and barely sets in June. The moose is perhaps the definitive animal of this ecosystem, not because it is the most numerous or even necessarily the most ecologically significant, though it is certainly that, but because it is so thoroughly adapted to its specific set of conditions, and because its relationship to the boreal forest is so deeply interactive that the two cannot really be understood separately. A mature bull moose is primarily a browser. It eats the stems and leaves and bark of willows, aspens, and other deciduous shrubs and trees, consuming enormous quantities of vegetation each day to support that massive body. In winter, when snow depth makes foraging on land difficult, moose will often wade into shallow water to feed on aquatic plants, their long legs and large hooves giving them access to areas that other large herbivores cannot reach. This feeding behavior has significant effects on the vegetation of the boreal zone. Areas of heavy moose browse look distinctly different from areas without moose. The shrubs are pruned to a specific height. Certain plant communities are suppressed while others are favored. The moose is, in the language of ecology, a keystone herbivore, an animal whose presence or absence reshapes the environment for everything else. And the rut, that annual cycle of hormonal intensity that made the bull on Marcus's trail such a dangerous animal, is the pivot point around which the entire ecology of moose behavior turns. In the weeks leading up to the rut, bulls stop eating almost entirely. They are running on reserves, burning through fat accumulated over the summer, sustained by the biochemical imperative of reproduction. They travel enormous distances in search of females. They mark territory with urine and glandular secretions. They fight, sometimes catastrophically, the clashing of those great antler racks carrying a sound that can be heard from extraordinary distances in the still autumn air. The fights are not always just ritual display, though display is certainly part of it. They can be genuinely dangerous. Moose have been found dead from injuries sustained in rut combat, antlers locked together in ways that neither animal could separate, dooming both. The bull that Marcus encountered was in the middle of all of this. It was an animal operating under conditions of extreme physiological and behavioral stress, an animal whose normal caution and tendency to avoid confrontation had been partially overridden by something older and more powerful than caution. Understanding this is not simply an academic exercise. It has direct practical relevance for anyone who spends time in moose country during October and November. But there is also a broader context here, one that extends beyond the individual encounter on that specific trail. the boreal forest is not a static place. It is changing, and the changes are happening at a pace that has no real precedent in the history of the ecosystem. The climate of the northern hemisphere is shifting in ways that are affecting everything from the timing of the seasons, to the distribution of plant communities, to the behavior of the insects that form the base of the food web. Fire regimes are changing. The timing of ice formation and melt is changing, and species that have evolved over thousands of generations to live in very specific conditions are being asked to adapt to conditions that are changing faster than natural selection can track. For the moose, some of these changes are particularly significant. One of the most important is the changing distribution and population dynamics of the winter tick. Winter ticks are external parasites that attach to moose in autumn, feed through the winter, and can, in heavy infestations, kill the animal through blood loss and secondary infections. Moose have not evolved effective grooming responses to ticks the way deer have, probably because for most of their evolutionary history, the deep snows of the boreal winter were enough to interrupt the tick's life cycle before populations could reach catastrophic levels. But as winters shorten and early snows become less reliable, tick populations are exploding. In some parts of the moose's range, calf survival is being dramatically affected by tick loads. Adult animals are showing up in spring emaciated, their coats rubbed nearly bare by the desperate scratching that heavy tick infestations provoke. At the same time, moose are facing competition and predation pressure from species that are expanding northward as the climate warms. White-tailed deer, which carry a brain parasite called Pareliphostrongylus tenuis, or brainworm, to which they are largely immune, are moving into boreal habitat. When moose pick up the same parasite from contaminated vegetation, the results are often fatal: neurological damage, disorientation, the loss of the normal fear response that keeps moose safe from predators. Moose infected with brainworm have been documented behaving in ways that are deeply unusual, walking in circles, approaching humans and vehicles without apparent fear, losing the orientation that allows them to navigate their home territories. The wolf, the moose's primary predator across most of its North American range, is itself subject to shifting dynamics. In some areas, wolf populations are recovering after historical persecution, and recolonization is changing the predator-prey balance that has shaped moose behavior for millennia. In other areas, human hunting pressure and habitat fragmentation are reducing wolf numbers. The moose lives at the intersection of all of these forces, shaped by them, responding to them, and in turn shaping the ecosystem around it. But on that trail, on that October morning, all of this broader context was very far from Marcus's mind. What occupied him entirely, in the way that genuine danger occupies the mind to the exclusion of almost everything else, was the immediate, physical, overwhelming reality of the animal in front of him. And when he thought about it afterward, when the shaking had subsided, and he had driven home and made coffee, and sat in the warmth of his kitchen, trying to process what had happened, what struck him most was not the fear, though the fear had been real and profound. What struck him most was the quality of his own perception during those minutes on the trail, the way every detail had been rendered with extraordinary clarity. The vapor from the moose's nostrils, the particular sound of the second moose calling from somewhere in the trees, the texture of the trail surface under his feet, the cold weight of the air. There is extensive scientific literature on this phenomenon, hyper-detailed memory formation under conditions of extreme stress, the way the brain in states of high arousal floods the hippocampus with signals that say this is important, encode this precisely, do not let the usual blurring and forgetting happen. It is an adaptive response, obviously, an animal that survives a dangerous encounter and retains precise memory of all the relevant details, the smells, the sounds, the visual cues, the behaviors that worked and those that didn't, is better equipped to handle the next encounter. This is true whether the animal is a human runner on a boreal trail or a wolf cub learning the range of a bison's kick. Marcus found himself replaying the encounter in granular detail for days afterward, not with anxiety, though there was some of that too, but with something closer to fascination. He had been that close to something genuinely wild, something operating entirely on its own terms, something for which he was simply an obstacle or a signal to be assessed and responded to. He had been inside the ecology, not observing it from the outside, not reading about it, not watching it on a screen. He had been standing in the middle of it with no barrier between himself and the full, unsettling reality of what wild animals actually are. He went back to the trail. Of course he did. Not immediately, and not without telling several people exactly where he was going and when to expect him back. He went back 3 weeks later, when the rut was winding down, and the bull's hormonal state would presumably be returning to something more like normal. He ran the trail in the early afternoon, when visibility was better and the light was good. He took the section where the encounter had happened slowly, moving quietly, watching the trail ahead. There was no moose, but there were signs of the moose, and of the second moose, and possibly of others. The willows on either side of the trail had been heavily browsed, the stems bitten off at characteristic heights. There were places where the soft ground at the trail edge had been churned by large hooves. He found a scrape where a bull had pawed at the ground and left a scent mark. He found tufts of coarse dark hair caught on a spruce branch at chest height, left there when the bull had pushed through the trees. The animals had been here. They were probably still here, somewhere in that forest, going about the enormous business of being alive in the boreal zone. The encounter on the trail had been, from their perspective, probably a minor and quickly forgotten interruption. A strange-smelling biped standing on a path, presenting no real threat, easily waited out. The bull had moved off the trail not because Marcus had frightened it, but because the more interesting sound from the second moose had reclaimed its attention, and a non-threatening stationary human was simply not worth the energy of further engagement. That realization was, strangely, both deflating and liberating. The encounter that had been the most intense few minutes of Marcus's recent life had been, from the moose's perspective, an unremarkable Tuesday morning. This asymmetry is fundamental to understanding what it means to spend time in truly wild places. We carry our experiences of those places with great weight and significance because for us they are extraordinary, departures from the insulated environments we normally inhabit. For the animals, we are simply one more variable in an environment full of variables. They assess us, they make decisions about us, and then they move on. They do not lie awake at night replaying the encounter. They do not tell their friends about it. They are embedded in the present in a way that humans have largely lost the ability to be, and that embeddedness is both what makes them so difficult for us to fully understand and what makes encountering them so affecting. The boreal forest around the trail carried dozens of other stories on that afternoon when Marcus returned. A raven followed him for most of the run, calling in that complex, almost conversational way that ravens have, perhaps curious, perhaps simply finding the moving human useful, as a means of flushing small animals from the undergrowth. At one point, he startled a spruce grouse from a low branch. The bird exploded upward in a whir of wings that sent his heart lurching again, and then settled on a slightly higher branch and watched him with the particular incurious gaze of a bird that has not fully learned to fear humans. He crossed the tracks of a wolf in a muddy section of trail. The track was large and fresh, the edges still crisp. Wolves in this part of the forest were rarely seen, but their presence was woven into the ecology in ways that showed up everywhere once you learned to read the signs. The browsing pattern of the moose was partly shaped by wolf behavior. Where wolves patrolled regularly, moose moved differently, avoided certain areas, spent less time feeding in open areas. The entire forest was a record of these interactions, a text written in tracks and browse lines, and the territorial markings of animals that were themselves part of a system stretching back thousands of years. He ran the last few kilometers back to the trailhead in the long, low light of a November afternoon, the sun already dropping below the tree line. The forest was transitioning into its winter mode, the deciduous trees now bare, the spruce and fir carrying their own weight in deep green against the gray sky, the ground beginning to harden toward frost. The animals here would have to endure months of cold and snow and scarcity before the brief explosion of summer arrived again. The bull moose that had stopped him 3 weeks earlier was almost certainly in that forest somewhere, having survived the rut or not, having found a mate or not, beginning the long process of rebuilding the reserves that the rut had consumed. If it had survived the rut, if no predator had found it weakened and alone, if no hunter had taken it during the season, it would face the winter in whatever condition the rut had left it. Bulls that enter winter in poor condition after a particularly demanding rut do not always come out the other side. This is the reality of wild animal lives, not the romantic version, not the version where every encounter ends with the animal loping gracefully into the trees to continue its long and successful life. The reality is harsher and more interesting than that. It is full of contingency and chance and the grinding arithmetic of energy budgets. Every calorie matters, every injury matters, every day of severe cold in January matters. The boreal forest is an extraordinarily productive ecosystem in summer, and a profoundly demanding one in winter, and the animals that live here year-round have evolved every possible strategy for bridging the gap between abundance and scarcity. For the moose, the primary strategy is size itself. That enormous body, those long legs that carry it above the deepest snow, the wide splayed hooves that function as snowshoes, the dense layered fur that insulates against temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. These are not random features. They are solutions to very specific problems, shaped by the specific conditions of the boreal zone over thousands of generations of selection. But there are limits to what size and insulation can accomplish when the food supply is buried under a meter of snow and the cold is drawing heat from the body faster than metabolism can replace it. Moose in deep winter are operating on narrow margins. They move as little as possible to conserve energy. They stand in areas protected from wind. They eat whatever is available, bark and dead stems and the lower branches of conifers that retain some nutritional value even in winter. And they wait. Spring, when it finally comes to the boreal forest, comes with a rush that has no equivalent in more temperate climates. It is not a gradual warming, but an explosion. Snow melts within weeks. The willows and aspens push out new growth with extraordinary speed. Insects emerge in astronomical numbers. Rivers run bank-full with snowmelt. And the animals that have been running on reserves all winter flood back into activity, replenishing themselves on the new abundance. This is also when moose calves are born. The timing is precise and not accidental. Calves born at the beginning of the flush of spring vegetation arrive into a world of maximum food availability. Their mothers, who have been pregnant through the entire winter, have survived on those narrow margins for months and are now able to replenish their own condition rapidly while simultaneously nursing calves that grow at a remarkable rate in those first weeks of life. A moose calf in its first days of life is one of the more improbable-looking creatures in the North American fauna. All legs, an enormous nose, and wide amber eyes, it is already capable of following its mother within hours of birth, which is a necessity given the predator pressure on newborns. Wolves and bears both take moose calves when they can, and a cow moose defending a calf is an animal that combines the protective ferocity of a mother in full alarm with the considerable physical resources of a large ungulate. Wolves that approach too closely, and bears that miscalculate the distance can be, and sometimes are, killed by the flailing front hooves of a defensive cow. Marcus read about moose biology obsessively in the weeks after his encounter. He had always been interested in the natural history of the places he ran through, but the encounter had sharpened that interest into something more urgent, more personal. He bought books. He watched documentaries. He read papers from wildlife ecology journals, working through the technical language with the help of a good dictionary. He wanted to understand, as fully as he could, what that animal actually was, what its life was actually like, what the mechanics of the world he had been briefly, intensely inside on that October morning actually consisted of. He also started talking to people. He talked to a wildlife biologist who worked for the provincial government studying moose population dynamics. He talked to a Parks Canada warden who had spent decades managing human-wildlife conflict in the national park system. He talked to an Indigenous elder from the Cree community whose territory overlapped with the forest where he ran, a man whose relationship with moose was not one of occasional dramatic encounter, but of deep, ongoing participation in the same ecosystem, a relationship built over generations, shaped by respect and necessity, and the particular kind of knowledge that comes only from sustained, attentive presence in a place. The elder told him things about moose behavior that Marcus had not found in any book. Practical things, observational things, things that came from a tradition of watching these animals carefully and consistently across many seasons and many years. He talked about the way moose respond differently to humans depending on the history of hunting pressure in a particular area. He talked about the behavioral cues that indicate a moose moving from assessment to aggression. He talked about the landscape features, the specific configurations of terrain and vegetation that moose prefer during the rut, so that a person who knows those features can anticipate where encounters are most likely and adjust their route accordingly. None of this knowledge was in any official trail safety guide. It was not on any sign at any trailhead. It lived in the memories of people who had paid attention, over long periods of time, to things that most of the people running those trails had never thought to look for. This is one of the recurring themes in the ecology of human-wildlife conflict, The gap between the knowledge that exists in communities with long histories of coexistence with particular animals and the knowledge that reaches the much larger population of people who are encountering those animals for the first time, or the second time, or the 10th time. Trail running has exploded as an activity in recent years. More people are using more trails in more remote areas than at any point in history. The infrastructure of information that keeps those people safe, the signage, the safety briefings, the encounter protocols, has not kept pace with the growth in participation. The warden Marcus spoke with was thoughtful and measured on this subject. He did not say that people should stay out of wild areas. That was not his view at all. His view was the opposite. He believed deeply that direct experience of wild places and wild animals was essential, that it created a connection that could not be replicated by any other means, and that people who had genuine encounters with wildlife, people who had stood on a trail and faced a moose, or heard a wolf, or watched a bear working a hillside for berries, were more likely to understand and support the conservation of those places and those animals than people who had only ever seen them on screens. But he was also clear that genuine encounters that come out well, require preparation. Not heroic preparation, not specialized training, preparation of a very basic kind, the kind that takes an hour to acquire and can make all the difference in the moment. Knowing what species you might encounter and when they are most dangerous, knowing the behavioral signals that indicate escalation, knowing the general principles of what to do and what not to do, knowing how to manage your own response, your own body, in a situation where every instinct is pushing you toward actions that might make things worse. Marcus thought about all of this as he ran through those forests in the weeks and months after the encounter. He thought about how close the outcome could have been to very different. Not because he had done anything particularly wrong, but because the margins in an encounter like that are genuinely narrow. A moose that charges covers the distance between itself and a person in seconds. A person who runs triggers a pursuit response in an animal that can cover ground at speeds no human can match. The trail was the only route. The forest was dense. The circumstances were, in the plainest possible terms, ones that could have ended very badly. They did not. They ended with a man sitting on a rock in the cold, shaking, alive. And there is something in that outcome worth paying attention to. Not the drama of it, not the adrenaline of it, though both of those things are real and deserve to be acknowledged. What is worth paying attention to is the way the outcome was shaped not by luck alone, but by preparation, by the practical knowledge Marcus had accumulated before he ever set foot on that trail, by the discipline to apply that knowledge under conditions where every instinct was screaming something different, and by a quality that is harder to name but that shows up consistently in accounts of people who navigate dangerous wildlife encounters successfully, a quality that might be called attentiveness or presence, or simply the willingness to be fully in the situation rather than fleeing it mentally while standing still physically. That willingness to be present, to hold steady, to think rather than simply react, is not heroism in any conventional sense. It is not bravery. It is something quieter and more practical than bravery. It is the application of understanding to a moment that demands it. The moose moved off the trail and into the trees. Marcus walked backward up the rise. The forest went on being a forest, full of the quiet negotiations and competitions and dependencies that have been going on there long before humans arrived, and will go on long after whatever we build along its edges has crumbled and been reclaimed by spruce and fir. There are, in the boreal forest and in wild places everywhere, thousands of stories like this one unfolding every day. Most of them have no human witness. A wolf tests a moose calf and retreats when the cow charges. A bear and another bear negotiate a salmon stream with a complex choreography of posture and avoidance and occasional direct contact. A lynx and a fox meet on a frozen lake and make their assessments and part without incident. The forest is full of these encounters, full of these negotiations, full of the continuous, low-level management of risk and opportunity that is what animal lives actually consist of, stripped of the narrative we impose on them. When a human enters that world, even briefly, even on a maintained trail in a provincial park, they enter that ongoing negotiation. They become, for the duration of their presence, one more variable in an ecosystem that has been managing variables for a very long time without any help from them. The ecosystem is not interested in them. It is not hostile to them. It simply continues, absorbing their presence and responding to it according to principles that have nothing to do with human expectations or narratives. What Marcus took from his encounter, in the end, was something like humility. Not the sentimental Instagram caption variety of nature humility. The genuine article. The recognition that the forest is not a backdrop, not a trail network, not a recreational amenity. It is an actual place, full of actual lives being lived according to actual imperatives. And occasionally, if you are moving through it alone and paying attention, you will be reminded of this in ways that you will not quickly forget. He still runs that trail. He goes in the summer now, mostly, when the rut is months away and the long boreal days stretch out and the willows are thick and green and the calves, if the cow has been successful, are following their mothers through the undergrowth with those enormous knobby legs and that improbable lurching grace. He has seen moose on nearly every run since. He has learned to read the trail for signs of them, to note the freshness of tracks, to pay attention to the ravens whose behavior often signals the presence of large mammals nearby. He has not had another encounter at the level of intensity of that October morning. But he runs differently now, more quietly, more attentively, with a quality of presence that the encounter gave him and that he